Well, thank you all for coming tonight, and I hope you enjoy the program. I'm going to talk about our program to restore coastal wetlands at Prisoners Harbor. I hope this works. Prisoners Harbor is on Santa Cruz Island, which is located in the Southern California Bight. And the restoration of the wetlands at Prisoners Harbor will be part of a broad-scale restoration of wetlands and riparian communities throughout Southern California. Santa Cruz Island is influenced by two coastal currents, a cold current coming down from the north and a warm current coming up from the south. And the fact that it's an island with these two currents converging make it a unique habitat. And because it is the largest of the Channel Islands and these ocean currents, it has the most diverse, not only habitat, but diverse flora and fauna of all the islands. Oops. Okay. You can think of the island as a biodiversity hotspot. There's 12 endemic species and 11 federally listed species on Santa Cruz Island. The project that we're proposing is part of a long-term island strategy for island restoration. And these programs have included the bald eagle reintroduction on Santa Cruz Island, successful fox reintroduction on Santa Cruz Island, and I just want to point out the little nursing puppies down here. So those are all part of the captive breeding program. There's been the golden eagle relocation, the feral pig eradication, sheep removal, and weed control projects. So with these large-scale stressors to the ecosystem on Santa Cruz Island removed, the park is now considering restoration of localized areas, including Prisoners Harbor. So Prisoners Harbor, whoops, I gotta get used to this thing. Prisoners Harbor is located at the mouth of the largest watershed on Santa Cruz Island. 13 square miles, and it drains the entire Central Valley. And all the water that falls in the Central Valley flows out through Cañada del Puerto and out to the sea through Prisoners Harbor. So these island-wide restoration projects that have been going on for the last 20 or so years have had an impact on the island flora and the hydrologic systems on the island. So this is a photograph of the Central Valley during the sheep ranching era, and the sheep browse the island down to bare ground in a lot of places. Then in 1971, you can see there's some shrub. Whoops, some. I'm not using this anymore. There's shrubs on the side of the hill here, but shrubs are largely absent from this valley in the hillside. And then in 1999, a picture from the same location, about 15 years after the sheep were removed, you can see a lot of shrubs coming back in, a lot more growth here in this sort of creek bottom. And that brings us, okay, so going back for a minute, at the time when there was very little vegetation, when it rained, the rain would fall in the Central Valley and basically go right down the canyon to the sea. When the vegetation starts coming back, it acts like a sponge. It facilitates infiltration of the rain into the soil. The water goes into the groundwater, and it affects the whole hydrology of that watershed. Now down here at the mouth of that watershed is Prisoners Harbor, and this area was historically a back barrier coastal wetland and the largest wetland in the Channel Islands. It was about 12 acres, and it included a groundwater-fed freshwater marsh, a seasonal creek that flowed into a brackish sort of backwater lagoon, and that backwater lagoon was backed up by a gravel bar. And when the winter rains came, good strong storm would come through and it would break open this gravel bar. the water would pour out, and there would be some tidal exchange. And then within a matter of days, the gravel bar reforms and that lagoon reforms. Also during these flood events, the water from the creek would overflow the banks and flow into that freshwater wetland. So it was a very dynamic system. And the vegetation included wetland species, willow forest, marsh species, riparian communities, a broad diversity of community types. So this rich community was also important for humans, and the Chumash occupied this site for about 5,000 years. They had a village in this area. And then in about the 1960s, the ranching era began, and Prisoners Harbor was the focal point for all activity coming from the mainland to the island. So all the goods that were transported off the island came through Prisoners Harbor, and during that time, the late 1800s, the Prisoners Harbor wetland was filled. So this is where the wetland occurred, and it's all filled at this point. This is about 1900. They also built a stone retaining wall that channelized the creek and disconnected the creek from the floodplain. So before this retaining wall was constructed, during storm events, the water flows down the creek and flows into the wetland and recharges the wetland. It's flood storage and nutrient and sediment storage. When the stone wall was built, it also inadvertently directed this flood flow toward the Chumash archaeological site, causing significant erosion in the past. Okay, so the buildings, during the ranching era, the pier was built. This two-story adobe was constructed. The warehouse is still there. And there were sheep corrals here against the hillside. And you can barely see it, but there was a little scale house right here for weighing animals. So the adobe was demolished in the 1960s. But the warehouse is still there, and we still have that little scale house. This stone wall is long gone, and it was replaced by a berm that was bulldozed in place in the 1960s. So that connectivity between the creek and the floodplain is still missing. This is another shot of Prisoners Harbor, and this is basically standing at the pier looking down the access road. You can see the warehouse, and that's still standing. This is the little scale house that was situated adjacent to the warehouse, and then this was the sheep corral. And if you look off in the distance, you can see the two-story housing, or the adobe, which was, again, demolished in the 1960s after flood damage. Then in the late 1950s, when the island changed from a sheep operation to a cattle operation, the sheep corrals were removed, and these cattle corrals were constructed on the filled wetland. And you can see a more open channel here. This picture was taken after a flood, but it is a bit more open. And again, this was the filled wetland. Another action that the ranchers took was planting eucalyptus trees, and this picture here was taken in about the 1880s, maybe a little bit earlier. We don't have the exact date, but it's looking south from Prisoners Harbor towards the Central Valley through Cañada del Puerto, and you can see a much more open community than what we see today. There's an oak woodland in the background here. And a few eucalyptus were planted here, and the eucalyptus have escaped over time and filled the canyon bottom. So the goal of this project is to restore the coastal wetland and restore about 1 mile of the riparian community along Cañada del Puerto. And this sort of grayed out area is our project area. So it's the Prisoners Harbor area and then about 1 mile of Cañada del Puerto. So the goals of the project are to restore the wetland and the riparian communities, and we'll do that by removing the fill and removing the eucalyptus trees and replanting with native vegetation. Another goal is to restore the hydrologic processes, and we'll do that by removing the berm, removing the berm that occurs along the creek here and allow the floodwaters to reconnect with the floodplain. We'll protect cultural resources and will enhance the visitor experience. It turns out that there's about 8,000 people that disembark every year at Prisoners Harbor, and there's very little opportunity to learn about coastal wetlands, riparian communities, and this wonderful rich history that we have at Prisoners Harbor. To begin a project like this, there has to be what's called internal scoping, where the Park Service learns as much as we possibly can about the site, the hydrology, the natural resources, and the cultural resources. And we did this by conducting these various surveys and studies. So the first step was to learn about the extent and the depth of the fill in the wetland and to learn more about the groundwater dynamics. So we did that by installing 18 test wells, and we did that using a backhoe, and we would dig through the fill down to the original depth of the wetland. We had an archaeological monitor on site, so he could stop work in case we came into significant archaeological findings. Okay, all the yellow numbers indicate the location of a test well, and each one of these test wells was located in fill material. So that shows us a general extent of the fill, and it was all about 3 feet deep. The red numbers indicate wells that are in remnant wetland. And so in addition to these wells showing us helping us better understand the extent and the depth of the fill, it also allowed us to have a better understanding of the fluctuation in the groundwater seasonally. So each one of the wells had a piece of pipe, and about every month since 2005, we've gone and measured the depth of the groundwater. So we know how far it goes down in the summer and how quickly it rises in the winter. From this information about this groundwater fluctuation, we could develop a model for planting vegetation. And so, this dashed line shows the water elevation, the groundwater, and this slanted line shows the ground surface. So this is where the groundwater is above the surface, and this is where it's below the surface. So where you have standing water, you have tule marsh, and when it gets a bit bigger, the tule marsh can't tolerate that and will have open water. And then as the surface comes up, you have willow forests, and they like to have wet feet. They like to have their roots in the water in wet soils, so they're adapted for this water depth about groundwater about 0 to, or the surface about 0 to 7/10 of a foot above the groundwater. And then more upland sites, you have more riparian communities. Our next step was to look at the hydrology of the situation, and we had 3 questions that we wanted more information about that had to do with removing the berm. And so I'll go through those 3 questions one at a time rather than telling you all the 3 questions right now. But the hydraulic analysis had to do with looking at removing the berm, and we used cross-sectional data from each one of these locations. So the black line is a cross-section, an elevational cross-section. And then this is the archaeological site. So our first question asked about the frequency of overbank flooding with the berm in place and with the berm removed. And so this would address our goal of reconnecting the creek with the floodplain. So this is one of those cross sections, and this is the distance along the transect. This is elevation. And so this is through the filled wetland area, and this is the height of the berm. This is a natural creek bank, and this is the natural creek bank on the east side, the other side of the creek. So when the berm is in place, according to our model, that creek can hold a 100-year flood. So the water just shoots down and out to the ocean. If we remove the berm, here's the natural creek bank and the natural creek bank on the other side. And the model tells us that with the berm removed, the water will overflow its banks about with a 5-year flood. So this, by removing the goal, that would achieve, by removing the berm, that would achieve our goal of reconnecting the creek with the floodplain. So our next analysis had to do with protecting the archaeological site. We wanted to know what the estimated flow velocities are past the archaeological site with the berm in place and with the berm removed, because we don't want to see more erosion around the arc site and further deterioration of that resource. Okay, so this is, again, a cross-section just upstream from the archaeological site. This is the elevation through the filled wetland. This is the height of the berm, the natural creek bank. And these colors show the velocity of the creek during a 100-year flood. And this tells us that during a 100-year flood, the water flows against the bank at about 3 feet per second, which is fast enough to cause erosion of that bank. This figure shows the flow rates with the berm removed. So again, this is the filled wetland. The berm is removed. Here's the natural creek bank. The water overflows the bank, and when it overflows the bank, it spreads out, and the current velocity drops. And our model tells us that when this situation occurs, the water flowing past the archaeological site is about 1 foot per second, which is low enough not to cause erosion of that bank where the archaeological site occurs. Okay, the third question that we asked, the third and final question, had to do with breaching the road crossing. Sometimes when there's a big flood, the water goes over the road crossing and the water passes down the road to the warehouse, which could impact the warehouse. And okay, so here's the road, and the road passes to the left off the screen to the low water crossing. Here's the figure. This is the road, this is the access road that goes in front of the warehouse. This is the point where you dip down to the creek and go up the other side. And with the berm in place, a 100-year flood passes over this road crossing, it breaches the road crossing, and heads towards the warehouse. With the berm removed, so the water's going down the creek, the berm is removed, the water passes into the floodplain, and the water never reaches that higher elevation. It never makes it over the top of the road crossing. So the hydrologic analysis tells us that with the berm removed, the chances of the floodwaters passing over that, breaching the road crossing and heading towards the warehouse is unlikely. And these are the 3 conclusions that about the frequency of overbank flooding. Yes, we would achieve the goal of reconnecting the creek with the floodplain. It would reduce the possibility of erosion of the archaeological site and reduce the vulnerability of the warehouse to 100-year floods. So So we did the groundwater analysis and our model for planting. We did the hydrologic analysis, and the next step was vegetation mapping. This map was put together by the Nature Conservancy, and it describes general plant communities. So the sort of olive green are the eucalyptus patches. The black area is the filled wetland, and these sort of bright green areas are native willow stands. Sort of a general description of the communities, which is important. Now this air photo is a 1929 air photo of Prisoners Harbor, and this is the Prisoners Harbor area. This is where the warehouse is. This is the remnant wetland, the channelized creek. This is a cultivated field, and this is also a cultivated field. And this is some fields, maybe hay fields up here, some bare ground. And if you follow the creek, you see an open area, and you see this little arc of vegetation here. This is all open. And this was eucalyptus planted in about 1880. Well, we did an oak survey and a eucalyptus survey, and the blue dots are blue eucalyptus trees, and the red dots are red eucalyptus, and the green dots are all the oak trees in Cañada del Puerto. So if we go back here, and we look at this little arc of vegetation, and then we go back here. Here's our little arc, and that arc of vegetation were oak trees. And they have been completely engulfed by red eucalyptus since 1929. So that was a pretty interesting find. Another part of doing the planning for a project like this is doing what's called public scoping. And we are interested in what the public has to say about our project, what their thoughts are on developing different methods for restoring the wetland and storing the Cañada del Puerto. So we had a preliminary site visit back in April of 2007. We published a notice of intent to prepare an environmental impact statement in 2008. That was followed by a 45-day public comment period in which we solicited input from the public on our proposed actions. And we had 2 open houses that, in which we described our project and proposed actions. With the help of the comments that we got, we have developed 2 or 3 alternatives for restoring the area. And that'll be available to the public in about 2 weeks. It'll be our environmental impact statement. And this is one of the alternatives. So this is our preferred alternative. And I'll just go through this map. These little blue dots are the wells, our test wells. The green area is where we'd remove the fill and restore the wetland. These marks here indicate where we would deposit the fill. So we scoop the fill out of this area, and then we bring it over and we deposit it here and here. And the polygons show where we would remove eucalyptus trees and restore that to an southern riparian woodland or an oak forest. We'd build a protective barrier around the archaeological site. And we would also have new interpretive signage, benches for people to sit on and bird watch, do whatever they relax, have lunch, whatever. And the second alternative shows again the water wells, the area where we would remove fill. And in this case, we would retain some of the cattle corrals. We would retain actually 2 of the cattle corrals. Oh, and I need to go back here. One other thing, the The little scale house is currently located about right here, and we would move that scale house to this location back to its original location by the warehouse. Okay, so the second alternative, we would remove the fill and retain these two cattle corrals and keep the scale house in its current location. The fill disposal area would remain the same. The eucalyptus removal in this location is the same. And the configuration of interpretive signage and benches would be slightly different. So in this alternative, there's a smaller amount of wetland that is restored, and some of the cattle corrals are retained. So with the preferred alternative, we would restore 3.1 acres of coastal wetland by removing the fill. We would restore about 20 acres of riparian woodland by removing the invasive eucalyptus. We would restore hydrologic processes by removing the berm and reconnecting the creek with the floodplain. And these actions would improve the habitat for endemic and rare and threatened and endangered species like Santa Cruz Island fox, the bald eagle, the island scrub jay, and a lot of smaller, lesser-known species. We would protect the significant cultural resources and enhance the visitor experience. So we expect that the draft environmental impact statement will be coming out in about 2 weeks, and it will be published in the Federal Register, or the announcement that it's available will be published in the Federal Register. The draft environmental impact statement will be available in the library. We'll have a press release on it, and that will begin the 60-day comment period in which we will be seeking comments from the public about the project. Comments can be mailed in, or they can be posted on the Channel Islands website or the NPS Park Planning website. So the planning for this project has been ongoing since about 2003. And a lot of people have contributed to the planning process, so I just want to thank the Nature Conservancy, who has helped us a great deal, the UC Natural Reserve System, the Santa Cruz Island Field Station, the Water Resources Division with the NPS in Colorado and Point Reyes, and also so many of the staff at Channel Islands, and they all know who they are, who've helped this out.